Well, good evening, everyone. I believe the mic is working. Thank you, everyone, for being out tonight. Good afternoon. My name is Dorans. I have the privilege of serving both as the President Pro Tem of Columbus City Council, but also, important to this discussion, the chair of both our Zoning Committee and Building and Zoning Policy Committee. Before we get started with tonight's hearing, I just want to do a quick round of thank yous for folks that helped put this together. From the Economic Development Team, Assistant Director for Growth Policy, Kevin Wheeler, who you'll be hearing from tonight. From the Department of Building and Zoning Services, Deputy Director Tony Celebrezzi, Assistant Director Festus Mainly Spain, and Chief Zoning Official Shannon Pine for being here with us. Appreciate all those folks from the departments being here. I want to thank our host here tonight, Gilley Senior Center and Department of Recreation and Parks for hosting this meeting here this evening. I want to thank my council colleagues, certainly Councilmember Remy, who I think is in the audience, and Council President Hardin, who's here with me up front. Certainly my staff, Kevin McCain and Annie McDonald, for helping to put this together. CTV, who's going to be live streaming this for members of the public who are unable to join us here in person today. And certainly want to thank all the members of the public for being out here. August is when council is on recess, but we try to use August in a productive manner to make sure that we're engaging on community conversations such as this. So tonight, we're going to be hearing updates and priorities for Phase 1 of the Zone Initiative. As I mentioned, the CTV team will be streaming this hearing on our council's and the city's Facebook and YouTube pages. It will also be on the YouTube channel following this event. But before we get into the meat of the sort of the discussion here, I want to pause and allow Council President Hardin to share any remarks that he might have about tonight's topic.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Very grateful for your leadership and for pulling us together today. Only other addition to the thank yous is to one of the community affairs team, which I think you shouted out, but also to Mr. Brian Steele, our Columbus police officer, who keeps us all safe. So thank you, sir, and thank you all for being here. The biggest appreciation goes to you. This conversation that we're having, in my opinion, is probably the one or two most important things that we will do and talk about as a community over the next several decades. I am keenly aware as I look into this crowd that our littlest participant at the hearing today really represents what this conversation is all about. We are asking our community to go on a journey that is not as much for today, but for the next 35, 40 years in our community. Columbus has not updated its zoning code in 60 years. And the work that we will have to do over the next several months and several years will be to catch us up and prepare this community for what I call a tsunami of people coming. The analogy of tsunami is important to me because on a tsunami, for the first moments of a tsunami, it doesn't feel like the water's coming. And folks are on the beach. Sometimes they are frolicking in the water. And all the while, there is a thing, maybe unseen, that is coming that will have huge impacts on all of them. That's how I view this growth conversation, this zoning conversation. There is a wall of people who are coming to this community over the next 30 years. Our job as a community is to build the boat so that when the water comes in, we will lift all of us, not wash us out. The easiest thing to do would be to play on the beach and keep putting sand in the box and frolicking like nothing is happening and like nothing will change. Things are about to change in Columbus. So this conversation is critically important to all of us. How will we feel the changes? If we don't do anything, then the housing crisis that we are in right now will feel like nothing. It will. This is the early days of what happens when you don't have the supply for the demand that's here, and the demand that's here looks nothing like the demand that's going to come. What does it mean? It means that it took me 20 minutes to get to here from City Hall today because we had a little traffic on 71 North. It will take us an hour to get here in 20 years if we don't do the things that it takes to change how we live, how we work, and how we move along. So when I say that this is the most critical conversation for not just us, but our littlest guest here, because we're going to be okay for the next couple of years. It's 10, 15, 20 years about really, how do you want to leave this city in this community for your children and your grandchildren. That's what we're going to ask you to dig deep on. That's the journey that I'm asking you to come with us on. Change is always difficult. Change is always hard, but sometimes change is necessary. This is necessary. So I appreciate you for being here today. I appreciate you for being engaged. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Council President. I'm going to forego the boat metaphors because you beat me to them. But I do want to say and give folks that are here, I think we have a fair amount of area commissioners that are here with us and certainly community leaders from across the city. And I want to say thank you to those folks that volunteer their time every single week, every single month on a regular basis to be engaged on these issues, land use issues across the city of Columbus. As the Council President said, change is coming. It is inevitable. And many of our area commissioners have been on the front line of that change in their neighborhoods for decades in many cases. And that system that has allowed neighborhood feedback and supportive nature, we push to the brink. And I think a lot of area commissioners will probably tell you that the volume of rezonings and variances that are coming before them and ultimately coming before City Council, the reason for that is, as the Council President pointed out, is that growth. Right. So when we talk about, we have not had a comprehensive rewrite of our zoning code since the 1920s. Think about how much our city has changed since then, good and bad. And when the Council President talks about that growth that is coming, that means that change is inevitable as we move into the future. And I can tell you, every single week at City Council, sometimes it's a dozen, sometimes it's 24, rezoning and variances. And some of these are big, weighty questions in front of us about what is an appropriate land use question for a particular neighborhood or area of the city. And some of them are as simple as, We've had literally 35 minutes on the floor of council talking about whether or not a single reduction in a parking spot is appropriate in an area. So these are questions that we grapple with on a weekly basis. But when you think about the decades that we've had of land use recommendations that are simply out of date, and that's really the inflection point that we're at here in Columbus is how do we say what this looks like in the next 70 years, how do we prepare for that now in a manner in which both the Council President and I are fathers of young kids, and that tends to be the prism that I view this through. What is the city going to look like for my son in 15, 20, 25 years when he's ready to have a family of his own? And be able to see a city that will allow him to have the same opportunities that I moved to the city for. So when we think about why we're doing this, it's because the current process is frankly broken. We take months, sometimes years, for new projects to move through a pipeline, whether or not those are housing or job centers, et cetera. And every single time those things occur, it gets more and more difficult, again, when you talk about that growth that is hitting us, about how that's going to be managed on a day-to-day basis. So this ultimately is that chance for us as a community to do this work together. As the Council President said, to come together with us on this. As you'll hear from our presenters this evening, no decisions have been made at this point. We know the challenges, so we know what our problems are. We know there's a variety of solutions that are on the table, but what we're really interested in doing here is allowing folks to have an opportunity to hear from the early phases, the early engagement that has happened with the zoning initiative, continue to gather feedback as we head into this next step of the process. Council is committed to updating our zoning code. Yes. Allow me to say that again. Council is committed to doing this. We have no choice. The current system, as I've said, does not accomplish what we need to have accomplished to make sure that Columbus thrives in an equitable manner in decades in the future. So we are going to do this. We don't know what those answers are right now. We've got a lot of good ideas that are on the drawing board right now. We have had, a tremendous amount of engagement from folks that are intimately involved in this process, from the area commissioner level through applicants, through folks within our current bureaucracy. But the point of here today is to hear those updates, for folks to react to them, and for us to move into the next phase of this project. And I'm really excited about where this goes, because if you're here in this room, you're probably like me, you're a bit of a land use nerd. When you drive around the city and you can see different areas of the city have developed at different times, you can definitely tell. When we're driving down Morris Road, you can tell sort of the era in which this area of the city developed compared to when you're downtown or German Village or South Side. You can sort of see the different spans of development and how that's affected, the fabric of those communities. And this is really the question of how do we make sure that we're making smart decisions moving for decades into the future. So with that, I'm going to have the Mr. Wheeler from the Department of Development give a presentation about where we're at this point. We'll have question time for council members, and we'll have a time for public comment as well. So we should be able to get you out of here in a relatively short order on a very hot Monday night. So appreciate everyone being here. And with that, I'd love to turn the floor over to Mr. Kevin Wheeler.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, President Pro Tem Dorans, Council President Harden, and Councilmember Remy is here this evening as well. And I want to point out another member of the Zone N team is with us, James Lewis. James, if you could just raise your hand or stand up. I point out James because he's the guy to get to talk to if after the presentation you want to be on the mailing list, if you have questions, you want information. He's going to be better at it than I am. I'm going to go home and forget about it. James won't. So sorry about the screen size. We improvised tonight. We will put this presentation on our website. And if you have specific questions before we're able to do that, again, check in with James and we'll get you what you need. And there's no clicker up here, so I get to boss around Mr. Dorans. If you could get us started, please. Okay, I feel like the council president and council member have done a great job of covering slide one, just talking about the growth that the city is experiencing. A couple points on this slide I will mention though. One is that the trajectory of our population growth has been a straight line for a long time. What's different about our future is that the annexation patterns, the territorial growth that we've seen, is not going to characterize our future in the way that it has in the past. So we're going to be growing up more than out. Another thing I want to say is that, the zoning update is not the only thing going on. We've got a climate action plan. We have Link Us, an initiative by the city, CODA, Franklin County, Morpsey, and other partners to bring serious mobility advancement to our region. We're working on a housing strategy. So there's a lot of work being done across a lot of fronts that all in many ways ties together. Next. So many of you here probably know this. It's old hat. I apologize for those of you who've seen these presentations. The first few slides are going to look familiar. But if you don't know, zoning is a set of rules that regulates how you can use land, what we call that land use, residential, commercial, et cetera. And it regulates things like where the building can be placed, how much parking you need to have, how tall the building can be, and so on. It's different from policy. So if you hear about land use plans or policy, that's different. The code is law. It can encourage investment or it can discourage investment. It can create a barrier for investment or it can really pave the way for investment. Like restrictive covenants, for those of you familiar with that, like redlining, zoning nationally has been used as a tool of exclusion. It's been used to discriminate. And so that's a part of the history that isn't such a great thing. Next. Zoning equals a map and text. Every parcel in the city of Columbus is zoned something. You can look up on our zoning map online, figure out what it is, but then you need to look at the zoning text and figure out those two things together. It gets a little more complicated than that. Later on, I'll talk about that. But in principle, you've got a map and you've got text, and those two things go together to tell you what your zoning is. So why update the code? We've already talked about this. Our code was first adopted in Columbus in 1923. We updated it in the 50s. We've been modifying it since then. I don't know about you guys. You may have some parallel to your own life or your own house, but sometimes you need to take a step back and say, what is this all adding up to? And it's been 70 years since we've done that. And what we know, and this is Columbus, by the way, in the 1950s, it doesn't reach Worthington. I think Dublin at this point in time has fewer than 300 people. It has 50,000 now. Things are very different. And we know that this current code isn't going to get the job done for us. It's not going to support where we're trying to go as a community. We have a set of goals, and for those of you who may have missed it, there should be a two-page handout front and back that has our goals and then the priorities that we're going to talk about tonight. I'm not going to go through the goals because there's a lot of words there and you can read them. We created these as a starting point to kind of frame our conversation, but we really wanted to go deeper with the priorities, and that's why we're here this evening. So we'll go through the goals again, a second set. There's a total of 5. So where to begin? It is a big city. It's 220 square miles, over 900,000 residents, and it's a complex code. We've spent 70 years creating all kinds of unique conditions, and so you don't just update a code like that overnight. It is complicated, it takes a while. So you've got to start somewhere, and we're going to start on our main corridors. These are places where we feel we can support improved transit, housing. It's where we feel that we can support our local businesses better as well. These are areas where we feel we can support compact patterns of mixed use, a variety of different uses, residential, commercial, et cetera, in the same areas to do some of the things that we as a community want to see in our city. These corridors and this kind of use are supported by our many community plans. We have about 4 dozen of them. Most of them talk about this in the main corridors. And this is a pattern that is very common in the older city where you walk to things from your home and you were able to get around easily on foot. As I said, it's not a new idea. This is one of my favorite pictures. Some of you have seen this before. It's Mount Vernon Avenue, 1960. The artist who passed it some time ago, Kojo Kamanu, took this picture. And this is just I don't think it's a special day in Mount Vernon. It just shows you the activity and the vibrancy of that corridor. And in many ways, I think that many of us long for that again. And we can't go back to the past and wouldn't want to go back to the past in many ways, but it does reflect some of the ability to just be out and about and do things that we'd like to see. This image is of Grandview Crossing, and I share it because we're in Northland tonight. And you'll think, well, okay, that's great for Mount Vernon, but we're in Northland here in this community. What does it look like for us? And I think this is at the northeast corner of Dublin Road and Grandview Avenue. This is a former landfill, and this is a site that's has been reimagined. It's being rebuilt. It's a mix of uses. And, this isn't, no site is perfect, no project is perfect, but these folks are recognizing that people would like to be able to be in one spot and get a lot of things done. They can live here, they can work here, they can go to restaurants, recreate, and so on. So this is the map. We have a map on our website it's interactive. You can drill down to an individual parcel and tell whether it's in or out. We can't do that at this scale. But as we began to say, okay, well, what corridors do we start at? One of the first questions was, where do we have CODA service now? And where do we hope to have improved service through our Link Us initiative? And then we started looking at our zoning patterns and our land use plans, and we created a map of focus areas. Collectively, there are 145 miles, if you count both sides of the street, 11,500 parcels. There are about 4 dozen base zoning districts in these corridors. There are about 1,000 variances, BZA and council variances, and there are hundreds of negotiated conditions through limitation text and commercial plan district. That adds up to just an incredible number of individual circumstances, each one of which is like its own little zoning code. No recommendation yet. You've heard that already. We want to emphasize that. There's nothing that we're about to roll out. We still have a lot of work to do. So why do we do these phase 1 priorities? I think several reasons. For one, we want to be more focused than those big picture goals on the sheets you have. Those are great goals, but they're not very specific, and we want to be more focused in our work. 2, we want to have some yardsticks that kind of help us know whether we're achieving what we set out to do. And then 3, we just need to provide some more context. Why is it that we had those goals? What are the big picture objectives that we as a city are working towards? These goals have been, or these priorities rather, have been informed by a whole bunch of initiatives or efforts and outreach steps. We've had literally thousands of interactions from the first period when we began this work We have an advisory committee that we meet with on approximately a monthly basis. We started this work a couple years ago with an assessment phase survey. Many of you participated in that. We've had community conversations, we've had Rise Up, we've had all kinds of things that many of you have been part of. We have an email list that's, I think, 2,200 names now. We have 25,000 visits on our website. I don't know how many thousand are me, but there are a lot of folks hitting it. So a lot of engagement, a lot of interaction. Next slide, please. Some of what we're hearing, there's all kinds of stuff that we've gotten feedback from, and I can't begin to try to portray it all. Among the things that we consistently hear about, no matter where we are, is people want walkable neighborhoods. They want bikeable neighborhoods. They want to be able to walk to things. They want better transit. They're worried about housing. They want more housing options. They care about design. They don't want us to just, take a pass on that. They care about the environment. They care about street trees and things that are green. Some of the specific quotes here from our advisory committee. Again, this is a group of folks that we just count on to give us some help as we think through this stuff. One of their main refrains is be bold. We need to think differently. We need new thinking to solve the problems of our future. Even people making good salaries can't afford housing. This is something that's changed in the 3 years that since I began talking about and thinking about this work. The housing situation that we're facing today is substantially worse than it was 3 years ago, and it's just getting worse. And many of you in this room today, if you haven't experienced it yourself, you have kids or family members or colleagues that have, and this is coming up more and more in people's lives as they just try to figure out, where are they going to live, how are they going to get by. Upgrade public transportation. This is a common desire for folks. And I'm here to say that one of the reasons we don't have better transit in Columbus is because our land use pattern is so diffuse. We can't have better transit without land use that supports it. They go hand in hand. We need businesses on our main corridors. We'll talk more about that. Couldn't agree more. And then finally, this is from our earlier work with the assessment. Density equals equity. We need to create density in order to create a more equitable community. And we'll talk more about that. So these are our phase one priorities. I'm not going to read them because we're going to go through them one by one. You should have them on your sheet. Again, 5 priorities guiding the first phase. This is just the start of the effort. As we work through the corridors, we'll be then going to other portions of the city, neighborhoods and so on. Okay, the code does not support housing creation. So what we have here, we talked about the housing shortage, a lack of options and rising costs. Residential uses are either restricted or prohibited in 80% of those corridors we saw on that map. 80% of the biggest corridors in the city, you either can't do residential at all or you can't do it on the ground floor. It's also the case that the majority of the corridors have a 35-foot height limit. That's the height limit you have for your home. If you live in a single-family neighborhood in Columbus, 35 feet. That applies to 80% of these corridors. Parking requirements exceed demand in many cases and add to the housing costs. This particular picture, this is on Cleveland Avenue. There are many corridors with many sites like this. And we know that zoning is just one part of the puzzle. That doesn't mean that all the vacant sites all of a sudden are redeveloped, but it's an important thing for us to look at, see if we can sort of set the table to encourage the kind of development and investment that we need as a community. So one of our priorities, our first priority, is to leverage corridors to create more housing in more places. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll talk about what that means. Specific strategies. We need to adjust standards on our corridors. And one of the things that I want to point out is that we do not see all these corridor sections as the same. We recognize that there are a variety of different development types and circumstances, and so we're going to be looking at how we can tailor zoning tools to recognize that. But regardless, generally speaking, we need to look at height. We need to look at parking requirements. We will be doing that. We need to look at other standards in the code that constrain development and density in these corridors. We need to allow a variety of housing options. Currently, this is a concern for us. We want to be able to unlock some of the capacity that our city has. And I think one of the things to remember in Northland is a community that at one point was one of the biggest retail zip codes in the state. Now, we've still got Easton, and so, it's not as though retail has left the community, but you've seen the changes and the evolution here. And so we're going to need to do a better job of accommodating that. We need to support housing affordability. And so one of the things we're going to be doing is, what's the role of the zoning code in doing that? Again, zoning doesn't solve the problem, but it's one piece of the puzzle. And then finally, we want to expand the areas where residential is permitted. That 80% restriction is a real challenge for us. This is just a picture, an example. Mulvey Place is at Cleveland and Myrtle. And this is a project that Homeport did. It's being developed now. It's on the CMAX bus service. It's supported in both the North Linden Land Use Plan and the One Linden Community Plan, and it's bringing senior housing and retail space to that community. They had to go through a bunch of zoning and rezoning and variance steps to do this project. And one of the things when I was talking to Leah Evans, the Homeport president, was she was disappointed that in the end they weren't maybe able to go a little higher to get more units in a place that desperately needs housing for seniors. Current code doesn't support local business. So the code hasn't kept up with retail. I think about this, and Northland is a great example. If you think, depending on how long you've lived in the city, there was, World War II, remember the city was only 40 square miles, and people were walking places. Many homes didn't have a car, or maybe one. Then you had the first generation of auto-oriented shopping malls, like Graceland, Town and Country, if you remember those. Those were displaced by Northland and Eastland and Westland. Maybe not displaced, but certainly they were no longer the top dog. Then you had another generation of Polaris and Easton and even City Center, for those of you who remember that. Then you had the big box boom. You drive up 23 High Street between Columbus and Delaware, and I swear, it was just oceans and oceans of big box. And today, who's the number 2 retailer in the country? Anybody want to guess? Amazon. That's right. Number 2, only behind Walmart. And, we do this, have conversation in 5 years when we've gotten a lot accomplished, council members. Amazon's probably going to be the number 1. There's just a lot. These things are changing. And so we have too much commercial zoning and not enough customers. This is one of our challenges. And we have parking standards that make it really hard to reuse an older building like this. And I'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute. So second priority, support Main Street jobs and businesses. In the next slide, we'll talk about the strategies. Increase the customer base for local business by accommodating additional housing within walking and biking distance. And we know people are going to drive, but as more people we can get close by, the better off our businesses will be. Secondly, when we have 80% of these corridors restricted to commercial use in a market that's so saturated, it makes it tough for people to be viable. It makes it hard to reuse older buildings. And so we need to open up the range of uses. One of the things that we've learned, and we have folks here that are going to help me with questions tonight, but one of the things that folks from BZS, Building and Zoning Services, have learned is that things like artist spaces, manufacturing often gets pulled into the manufacturing zoning district. And it's just a little thing that you're all like, well, they should be able to do that, make jewelry there, but often they can't. And so we want to look at these kinds of things. And then secondly, adjusting parking requirements. And this next image will show you why we think that's so critical. So this is Common Grounds. It's on Parsons Avenue at Deschler. It's a coffee shop cafe. I encourage you to go there if you haven't been there. Near South Side plan. I think I've never heard anybody who doesn't like it, isn't happy to have it, recommended the plan. They needed to get a variance for parking because it's a building that was built before parking was really a thing. They needed to provide 20 parking spaces. They have 0. And so they had to spend thousands and thousands of dollars and were delayed for months to do something that everybody wanted them to do. And you multiply that times all the older buildings that we have, and I know that folks want to see our older buildings reuse, we need to find ways to lower those barriers. Current code does not support equity. We've talked about how complex the code is. We rely on site-by-site negotiations. 96% of the time when these gentlemen and their colleagues are making zoning decisions, they're having to work on a very site-specific basis to come up with a combination of zoning that works, because our code just doesn't apply to a lot of development that we all want to see. And this is a barrier, particularly for smaller scale folks. Bigger scale developers have the means and experience to hire folks to help them navigate this. But if you're a small business owner, if you're common grounds and you're just trying to get a start, this is a big barrier for folks. Scattered decision making process creates uncertainty, and it leads to inconsistent outcomes. Not every neighborhood is ready to sort of negotiate and go through this process, and so we need to lift the base and make it more applicable to our community. So we want to promote a more equitable city, and some of the strategies for this is to have less reliance on site-by-site negotiations by fixing the base code to be more consistent with what we're trying to achieve. We want to ensure quality development in all neighborhoods by having consistent building design standards that are objective. We want to increase housing supply and affordability because that's so central to opportunity, particularly in proximity to good transit, jobs, education, healthcare. These are all things that are fundamental to opportunity. And then finally, we do recognize that zoning is, again, you've heard me say it, but it's just one part of the puzzle. And so we need, as a city, to be thinking about other ways that we can come into communities and support them. Okay, just two more. We're getting towards the end. The current code does not support transit, walking, biking. This picture could be anywhere. Anywhere USA. It happens to be near Sawmill and 161. And our current code does a great job of accommodating cars and necessary parking and so on. And again, we want to be realistic. People drive. We probably all drove here tonight. It's hard not to. But we also want to provide options as we move forward. We want that to not have to be the case. And so another priority for us is to expand the role of corridors in creating healthy, connected communities. If we go to the next slide, we'll see some strategies for that. So one is to increase densities, residential densities, also other uses, particularly near transit. Another is to align parking requirements with transit access and mobility objectives. Right now, our base parking requirement applies to 95% of the city. Morse Road, Sawmill and Bethel, Marion Village, Schumacher Place. It doesn't know the difference. It doesn't know geography. And yet we have different parts of the city that have sidewalks, and it's bikeable and has great transit, and we're working to extend that. And so we need a code that's frankly smarter about these things. A couple more things on this one. We want to have site design standards that do a better job of elevating walkability and bikeability. And we also recognize that compact and mixed-use development patterns are the best way to sort of provide alternatives to driving a car everywhere. And that's really important because that has an impact on greenhouse gas and the air we breathe. And that's something that we all care about. And certainly, as I see this baby over here, the baby's going to be impacted by the decisions that we make today. So we talked about elevating the role that corridors can play with mobility. This is a project on West Fifth Avenue. It's called Makeley Place, not to be confused with Malby Place. And Makeley Place is served by CODA. There's a bus stop right in front of it. There's a KOGO. KOGO is the bikes that you can use across the city. I took this picture from my bike, and it has 140 units. There are shops, restaurants, a park nearby, and it had to go through a series of variances around height and parking and so on to get approved. And this is an example of something that we would say, this has really been a great addition to the corridor. How do we ensure that we're getting good results, but not add those barriers of time and cost to the project? This is the last set of priorities. The current code does not support quality design. Our code lacks basic building design guidance. And the way that we compensate for that is spend an incredible amount of time and energy, not only as a staff, but as a community with applicants, trying to work out solutions. And often those solutions, we can predict them. We know what we are often trying to get to, but it can be a really painful process. And we had this picture. This picture was drawn not because anybody wanted to build it, but you could build it. And oftentimes we feel like we're starting with something like that and having to work up when we should be starting at a much better level. And so this requires us to look at site-by-site negotiation that leads to inconsistent outcomes. So we want to foster good urban design and appealing main streets. And we want to do this with a series of strategies. So we know that we need a range of zoning districts, mixed-use zoning districts that better serve our main corridors. And I mean a range so that we can accommodate a variety of circumstances. And we need to allow these areas to evolve over time. We need to recognize that things don't change tomorrow. Often it's always iterative. It may take years for some of these corridors to evolve. And so how can we set the table so that they can evolve over time and be serving our community in a better way? We need clear, objective design standards. If we're going to have standards for building design, just basic building design that makes sure that it's relating to the street and the pedestrian, we want those to be clear so that everybody, the applicant, the community, sees them and understands them. And then, again, we want to reduce barriers to adaptive reuse of buildings. This image here is a mix of buildings. Some are old, some are new. And, again, there's a lot of barriers to reusing the buildings that we often care the most about. Okay, so next steps and timeline. So no recommendations yet. We have more work to do. We're going to be talking with folks with more and more detail as we move forward. We've got analysis, community engagement. We are developing, new districts that we'll be talking about. We'll be sharing in the spring, late spring in 2024, and giving folks an opportunity to react to those, comment on those. Changes to the zoning code and map require approval by the city council. This isn't something that we can do administratively. I don't get to do that. And so you'll be hearing more about that. And then later phases, as I said, we'll be moving into neighborhoods and looking at them and seeing, are there ways in which we need to be updating our zoning code there? Next slide, please. Opportunities to engage. So sign up for updates. Many of you probably already have. That's why you're here. We encourage you to do that if you haven't done that. We have an email address. I think it's on your handout. We have a phone line. That's new. That's on your handout if you're not an email person. We have online resources. There are reports and videos and things like that on our website. We will be doing a mailing in the next month or so to folks along these corridors to make sure that people who own property or live, rent in this area understand what's going on and have a chance to be involved. We'll be doing another survey. I know we've asked you to do surveys before, but it's helpful to us, and so we're going to ask you again. And then we're going to have a series of workshops that are coming up, currently geared for October, so that we can have more in-depth conversations with you. I think that's it. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll sit down and turn it back to the council member.
Thank you, Director. I am going to pause. I know Council President Harden has to run to another engagement, so I want to give him the first crack of any questions for either Kevin or anyone from the departments on the subject.
Not really a question. Just wanted to say one, thank you, Kevin. I think that you see the thoughtfulness that is going into this process, the true ask of the community to engage. This is a big conversation in the, Kevin said late spring, I'll say early spring when we really move this conversation forward. Is he getting red down there in the face? We do not want this to be a surprise. We don't want this to be something that is felt like it is sprung on the community. We are having these important conversations. He talked about thousands of points of community contacts. This is why your engagement is so important. We will act. As Councilmember Dorans said, we have to. We go back to our analogy. What would we do if we knew that something that was going to change in a negative way our community, if we knew that was coming, and we chose not to do anything about that, chose not to make our community better, safer, more equitable, more affordable for folks to live in, what would we do? So council will vote in early next year for some type of a change, and our ask is that you engage with us along the way. So I'm really grateful. I don't have any questions at this time, but just wanted to hit on those couple points. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President. Wanted to just, I think, ask a few questions I think that would be beneficial for sort of the group as we're sort of imparting on sort of where we're at and why. And I think this may be a little bit for building and zoning services. So when we talk about, say, common grounds on the south side, I do a lot of coffee meetings there from time to time. So how long does it typically take for a variance process currently? So again, adaptive reuse of an older building, really no other way to do this other than basically to give them the parking variance. Otherwise, nothing can literally go there. How long does it take from them to basically apply to the city to it coming before council, getting approved, and then being opening up their business? I know it's hard to say there's an average time or anything like that, but if you could give folks a little bit more of a clarity on, like, we keep talking about this adding time to the process and how that holds things back. And in that kind of instance, to Kevin's point, it's something that everyone said in the neighborhood they wanted, especially adaptive reuse of an older building that, again, you can't do, it literally can't add parking. There's no other way. It is the definition of a hardship. So how does that work?
Right. Typical Board of Zoning adjustment variance is usually 2 months minimally. It involves a staff review. City staff receives the application for comments, and then we are also forwarding that application to the Area Commission for their review and recommendation. And then it ultimately gets scheduled on the Board of Zoning Adjustment, and the Board of Zoning Adjustment they are the final approving authority. But then after that variance is approved, they still have to go through the building permit process. And they can't get their building permit until that zoning variance is completed. Right. Then it's reviewed by other review agencies after that. So the 2-month process for that variance is definitely adding a lot of time to especially a small business owner, and they might be looking at a financial deadline, mortgage deadline, whatever it may be. So it certainly, we certainly do hear all of this coming back from our applicants.
Thanks, Shannon. I think this question will be for Kevin. So one of the things I've tried to talk with a lot of folks as we've been sort of engaged in some of these discussions is that there's not like a one-size-fits-all solution. So as it sort of applies to height limits, right? So this is one of the big questions that's sort of before us, is that if you have basically a 35-foot restriction pretty much across most residential areas, lots of places are certainly built higher than that. But how do you make that, what is sort of the guiding decision or thought process around when we do get to a point where we're going to say, hey, in this corridor, it makes sense to go up to 40 feet or 45 feet? We're certainly not there yet, but can you talk through like why that matters so much in some of these areas?
Sure. So, one of the things that is interesting if you're a historian is that 1923 code, the lowest height limit in the city was 50 feet. And for many of these corridors, it was as high as 200 feet. So, it's not a new thing actually to be looking at height. But when you look at the current corridor condition, most of the corridors are zoned commercially, and you can't do residential on the ground floor. You need to do commercial. And we've already talked about how we have too much commercial zoning and not enough customers, so it's difficult to make that work. And if you if you are in a 35-foot height zone, that means that you maybe can put 2 floors of residential above a ground floor of commercial that you probably can't lease. And you have to park it at requirements, regardless of where you are in the city, that often may exceed demand and may not be possible on the site. And so when you add all those things up, you can't really make a project work in much of these corridors, many of these corridors. And so we have to begin to look at things like height and parking in order to make that happen. Now, we do recognize, that 145 miles of corridors are not the same. And so we look at the conditions within the community, what is the current area plan, what does that say, what are the lot sizes, what's the capacity of the area, is it a node? Is it a major intersection? Is it an area where you have bus service, et cetera? All these things kind of add up to beginning to help you understand, well, maybe this is a 4-story area, maybe this is a 6-story area, things like that. And then we also want to be talking to folks who build things. You know, very few of us have built our own home. I'm not guessing nobody here has, but maybe. And so we rely on folks to build, and we need to know, you know, do these districts work in terms of just those basic numbers. And so we'll be talking more about that. It looks like Tony might have something to add as well.
Just to add a piece from the building perspective, when a developer decides to go certain heights, there are certain additional requirements that the Ohio Building Code requires, not only for ADA, but for fire and safety pieces. So it may be that, yeah, they could get an extra floor in, but that might put them over a threshold that the investment of extra safety measures, of ADA requirement for accessibility may put that investment out of reach, and thus that extra floor may never occur. They may need 2 floors to get recouped that investment for that. So the zoning code plays a big piece, but so does the state building code, which is a safety-based code that that's basically how you connect the 2x4s to create a building.
Thank you. One thing I've heard from folks as the sort of first phase of this has started is, you know, we're talking a lot about the commercial corridors across the city, obviously not an insignificant area, but I've heard from folks asking, you know, why stop at the corridors? You know, why start here, pause, and then go to other areas of the city? So I just wanted to, you know, Kevin, allow you a chance to sort of describe sort of the philosophical approach that the department is taking with this at this time.
Sure. I think, you know, we recognize that the whole code needs attention, and we share the sense of urgency that council and the mayor has made clear to us. I neglected to mention the mayor earlier. He's made it clear that this is a major priority for him as well as council. And so, we have the support of our elected officials to do this really challenging work. Having said that, it's really complicated work, and it's important to do a good job. And, there are limits to how much we can take on at one time. And I think that what we want to do is work through these corridors. We're learning a great deal as we do this. And it would be our hope that as we move beyond the corridors, we're going to be, smarter and better at it earlier on. So I don't want you to feel like it's a guinea pig scenario if you're in the corridor, because we're pouring a lot of time and attention into it. But again, this is where we feel like we have the most to gain by beginning the work, because these are areas where the community recognizes that this is where the action is or should be. And so that's an important point for us.
And so I think we've got a great turnout, from area commissioners and civic associations, and I think we've got a number of folks in the Northland Community Council, since we're in their backyard here tonight. So I want to thank all those folks for being here. But our 21 area commissions and civics have been sort of engaged in this process for a number of years. And Kevin, and when you talk about that site-by-site negotiation, I think they're sort of the folks that sort of oftentimes start with that. At the same time as it's sort of working its way through the planning process of the city simultaneously, right? So one of the things that when you talk about those design standards mattering, so again, we've had lots of reliance on that site by site, and then at the same time, we're potentially moving away from that if in fact there's the ability for folks to do more things as currently are zoned, that they don't need a rezoning or a variance, but the focus is still making sure there's high quality development happening within those areas. So wanted to allow you to sort of respond to, again, if I'm sitting there as an area commissioner or a civic association leader, I think, how do I make sure that things continue to develop in a way that's high quality and I have a voice as those things happen throughout that process?
That we get frequently. And I think, as you may know, some of you may know that I was previously in the planning division, and in that role, I worked with development review for many years, and was part of conversations and negotiations with developers and community members as we tried to make things work. And I think, there's a real desire and commitment on the part of city leadership to really be thinking about these things that matter to our community. But, doing it case by case, site by site, puts tremendous strain on our system and on many of our neighborhoods. It also means that projects are delayed. And Shannon, you mentioned 2 months for BZA, and I think that's probably the best case scenario, right? I doubt that that's the average. So we have a need to address some of those issues, but we don't want to do it at the cost of good design. And so you heard me use the term objective design standards earlier. And really what that means is that we have guidelines built into the code that are clear and measurable. It's not a policy, but it's a code requirement. And Shannon's the chief zoning official, and she's sitting next to me, and the first thing she's going to tell me if something isn't objective is, how am I supposed to measure that, right? So we have to be looking at those elements of building design that matter, and that can be, we can help to sort of frame, it's set up guardrails for development. And one of the things that, as I've talked to the community, this is critically important to many community members, and I think the development community understands that. They want clarity, and they would like to say, what are the rules? How do we respond? Give us some clarity. And so this is something I think we feel like we can really find some common ground.
And just to follow up on what Kevin said, the key for us is hearing from you all and hearing what you think the different things that we need to protect in certain areas. Are we going to be able to accommodate all of it? Probably not. But by giving us your input, we can get that into the mix and begin to have a code that comes out on the other end that is more objective, that is easier for anybody to understand and follow, and doesn't have essentially built-in delays. Because if you think about it, Shannon did talk about 2 months, but if you have an area commission meeting and there's one aspect or two aspects that maybe folks don't like in that meeting, the developer commits to going back and looking at it, that just adds another 30 days because the area commission doesn't meet but once a month. And that 30 days, they're still incurring costs of holding costs, and they're delaying their development. And of course, development has a certain life cycle based on the wonderful seasons that we have here in Ohio. And so if you get too far out of whack with it, it pushes the development back on 8 months because you've got to contend with the weather. And so our big message and our big hope is that people will be involved with this, will give us their feedback, do the surveys and the emails, and talk to us, talk to James, so that we understand what people are looking for, and we can put that in. And again, I'm always pretty blunt when I'm talking about this stuff. We're not going to be able to take everything. And as both council members said, doing nothing or the status quo in these corridors is probably not an option if we want to continue to see our city grow and succeed the way it is. I mean, without us, the state of Ohio is going backwards. Columbus is thriving. We want everybody to be part of that thriving piece. Sorry, I'm getting into a campaign speech here. But bottom line is, and a lot of you have heard me say it, is we need the involvement of the community so that we don't make decisions in a vacuum.
Hard to get the political speech out of a Celebrezzi, so happy for anyone to sort of react to this. So obviously Columbus is not the only city that is experiencing rapid growth, whether or not it's in the Midwest or otherwise, particularly when we talk about stabilizing housing prices. We're unlikely to see housing prices go back, and I think most folks don't want that, of course. But we would like to see a stabilization as quickly as possible of housing supply meeting demand in order to, again, stabilize and normalize prices, whether or not that's in the for sale market or whether or not that's rental-wise. Are there other cities, we've sort of talked about this across the country that have also tackled this very same issue, and what are some of the lessons that Columbus is sort of taking from some of those other communities as they've sort of gone through that process?
There are other communities or other cities that we consider to be our peer cities, and then there are neighbors close to home. We only have to look to Whitehall and Reynoldsburg as examples of two local communities that have made major changes to their zoning code to accommodate development on their main corridors, a mix of use and higher densities. At more of a peer city level, our consultant team brings the benefit of experience nationally, Peter Park, who's part of our consultant team, was the planning director in Milwaukee and Denver. And Denver went through a very similar process. Charlotte's gone through a very similar process. Raleigh's gone through a very similar process. Minneapolis, cities across the country. That's another one of the comforting things for people like me who are, trying to work on all this stuff that's complex, is that we can look to other cities and recognize that they've done it as well. And I think lessons the lessons depend on the city. Each city's a little bit different, but I think, one of the things that they recognize is that they have said, is that it's just critically important to be proactive. The longer you wait, the harder it is to respond. And I think, the results that we're seeing with the challenges to our zoning code, 70 years of accumulated, exceptions and unique conditions, just make it harder and harder progressively to deal with. And that ultimately finds its way to the price of a house or the cost of rent. I mean, this is just how it works. And so other communities, frankly, are in worse shape than we are in terms of housing crises and transportation challenges and so on. And, one of their biggest cautions is don't wait.
Thank you. Anyone else? I do want to pause. I know I have a colleague, Councilmember Remy, who's here. I don't know if he's got any questions for any of the departments at this point.
Thank you very much, Council President Pro Tem Dorans. Appreciate the opportunity to hear this tonight, and great to see so many familiar faces in the crowd. Thank you to Kevin Wheeler and Rama for their work, and certainly, the importance has been illustrated tonight, but, I want to bring in perspective as a realtor. In 2009, I got my real estate license, and, there was 16,000 houses on the market at that time. And most recently, we struggle to keep 1,400 houses on the market at any given time, and that's within our entire MLS, so not just specific to Columbus, but you can understand that because of the housing deficiency that we have in the city of Columbus, we have, people are moving here regardless. And this pressure is not going to let up. It's only going to intensify. And so this work is incredibly important. This is the first step, obviously, on the corridors, but certainly as we think a little bit more into neighborhoods, it's important that we have the opportunity for people that want to invest and want to build single-family homes into our community, obviously multifamily homes and retail. Making it easier for them to do so is critically important, because otherwise, these reassessed values that you see are going to continue to skyrocket. Again, talking a little bit more about stabilization, and that's really what we're hoping for. We don't want us to get to the point where no one can live in the city of Columbus because it is way too expensive. So this is important work. Your comments are very important. Everybody here, you have a say in this, and certainly we want to hear from you. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Councilmember. I did want to allow any closing remarks from the panel before we get to our public speakers. Thank you. One thing I did want to say before we go to our public speakers, and I think this is really important when we think about, I think Kevin mentioned in his remarks a number of times, is that our land use policy can drive investment or disinvestment. I think one of the things that's going to be very important for the city in the future, and is why it's incredibly important so many of our community leaders are here tonight, is that when we talk about that, the city's capital budget that invests in streets, sidewalks, water and sewer infrastructure, all the things that the bread and butter of keeping the city running, is going to be really hyper-focused as we move through this zoning initiative. Because again, if we're going to say we want to see more housing here, we want to see more employment centers here, we want to see more of X here, the public infrastructure has to be there in order to support that growth. And right now, certainly I think our capital planning is good, but if we're going to go through this whole process, I think we're going to get a lot better about being able to drive that capital investment to make sure that the neighborhood needs that are associated with development are there, whether that can manifest itself in a number of ways. So that's where, again, I know so many folks in this room continually advocate for needs within their certain neighborhoods across the city during that capital budget season. But as we move into this process, in which we're hoping to have a legislation on this next year, and continue community engagement, that's going to be something that's going to be incredibly important for folks that are interested in this, to make sure they continue that advocacy moving forward. But with that, I know we have two public speakers signed up to speak this evening. I'll allow folks on the panel to respond to any comments they have now, or if they prefer to follow up afterwards, I think we have their contact information. The first speaker is Miss Sandy Simbro. And we've got a microphone in the back for folks.
I understand I have 3 minutes. Good luck. I got it to one sheet of paper. First and foremost, Mr. Wheeler, some of us did build our own house. Some of us did have to go through the variance process. And so there are people in this room who have been around the block. Also, I want you to all remember, first and foremost, before you deal with anything else, you're dealing with human beings. We have a room full of human beings. Each one of us is the same, and we're very, very different. All of our needs are different. All of our wants are different. But we're all people. So keep in mind, you're dealing with human beings, not numbers and facts. One of the things that always intrigues me about the 35-foot height, when you make deliveries downtown, when you get caught in the wind tunnels, boy, do I wish those buildings were a little shorter. So you have to keep the environmental impact of taller buildings into consideration. And I really wish when you do your PR, stop saying that it hasn't been updated. When we're in these little meetings, you qualify it with the code has been, updated along the way, but you keep talking about this general overview. So many residents who have not been around the block think that means absolutely nothing has changed since 1928. Well, we all know it changed in the 50s and the 70s. And the one thing I've missed, maybe it's my own fault, what is the planning division's role in making these decisions? Are they participating also? And you talked about the tsunami of things that are coming. I hate to tell you, but we had that same conversation in 1970. And that led to Northland. You were there. Okay, so we've endured the tsunami before. But first and foremost, I am very interested in the frequent reference to redlining. Redlining became federally illegal in the 60s. If there is anything in our city zoning code or anything in any one of our city documents that in fact encourages that, it needs to be remediated right now. That's a federal law. That isn't something that we can just throw out there casually. If there is anything in our city code, in our zoning code, that directly says redlining or infers redlining, get it out of there now. 2, housing demand is driven by. I've never known what that is. And housing costs go up because building costs go up, because your insurance costs go up. Everything goes up. Equity. I wish someone would define equity to me. Equality and equity, 2 different things. Land use, rezones and variances. My experience over the last 50 years has been 90 days as an average, if everybody has a clean request. It's also the variance process is a great way of making sure that the development that happens within a unique neighborhood is appropriate to that neighborhood. Unique areas, unique codes. You alluded to that, Mr. Wheeler. The one thing, I don't know if you guys hear yourself saying this or not, but more than worrying about John Doe taxpayer out here, I've heard a lot of concern about the developers money, about the developers' time, about the developers. What about the citizens? So let's not worry about so much the developers as we do the development. Talk about walkable, biking. I don't hear, tonight was the first time I think Mr. Celebrezzi made reference to when you get to a certain level of buildings, you have to have ADA compliancy and everything. We have not talked a great deal about how the handicapped are going to get around in your bicycle world or for us old people that don't want to fall off their bikes anymore. We keep building more roads wider. On the one hand, on the other hand, we talk about reduced parking. So which is it going to be? 5 more lanes on 315 or more parking spaces? What do I do with the car once I get there? The city in 1952, you're right, it was Morris Road and High. That was the city limits. If I have my history correctly, we can thank Emmy Sensenbrenner, who said, this city's gonna grow. There's a tsunami coming, so we'll annex and we'll annex and we'll annex and we'll annex. That way, we get to control the growth. So we can thank Emmy Sensenbrenner for our giant scrambled egg. And I think that hits everything on my list. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. The next public speaker we have to come before the hearing is Mrs. Judy Minster.
Hi, Judy Minister, longtime Clintonville resident and former area commissioner. I've been selling real estate even longer than Emmanuel Ramey, my friend, since 1984, and I've been a broker in Clintonville since 1995. My house was built in 1918, and it is the newest house that I have owned in Columbus. The first one was 1906, the second one was 1912, and I've been in my my house since 1989. At any rate, I want to thank you for tackling this huge problem, and I think that it is time. We've made mistakes with rezoning in the past, and having served on zoning and variance in Clintonville, I've seen us try to undo some past mistakes. So if there was ever a time for micromanagement, which is usually like a bad thing, but in this case, I think it would be good. So for instance, in Clintonville, our 4-mile-long stretch of High Street, which is a major corridor, the kind of corridors you're talking about, it has 2 urban overlays, so 2 different setback lines. Plus it has a green zone, which is where my office is, and that's from Torrance Road up to Overbrook Ravine. So we need those green spaces, and that means there's no front parking, there's a green lawn in the front, and the buildings, whether they're single-family homes or offices, are set back from the street. So I hope we can avoid blanket rezoning of these big areas and really focus in and think about the aesthetics of an area, because I'm sure all the kids here want to have parks to play in. They probably all want a backyard. Like my kids grew up with a nice backyard. Not everyone wants to live in an apartment forever. Your typical apartment stay, according to National Association of Realtors, is 3 years. And I'll tell you, we live in a wealthy city, and it's getting wealthier all the time, and we're creating a lot of good jobs. I have open houses in Clintonville almost every weekend. And our migration pattern is from the short north, where a lot of renters live. And after 3 or 4 years, those young people are tired of their dense urban living, and they're coming north to Clintonville, and they've driven our prices up into the 500s. In 2018, my average sales price in Clintonville was $320, and last year it was $535. So these are people buying their first homes, and they're spending $450,000 to $500,000. So we know we're in a wealthy area with good jobs, but I think we need more single-family homes, right? We're planning for apartments. There were 22,000 apartments built, mostly downtown in Grandview, in 2022, and that's according to the Apartment Association. So something about our zoning code is allowing for growth now. I think we just have to be careful and not hit that, reckless pattern of it's going to be a crisis, so we have to hurry and rush. I'd just like to see you take things slow and be really careful with our city. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, those are the only two public speakers we have for this evening, so want to again thank everyone for taking the time to be here with us tonight. As we've talked about, this is the first phase of this large undertaking. As we've heard from the department, we will at council likely not receive recommendations until next year. So we are still in the listening phase. I want to make sure that folks have the ability to contact me. The best way to get a hold of me is my email, which is radorans, D-O-R-A-N-S, @columbus.gov. Certainly, I think the folks that are here tonight on the panel will sticking around for a few minutes, so I'm sure they'll be happy to provide their contact information or have an additional conversation with you all about what we're talking about here tonight. These are weighty topics. As we've talked about, change is inevitable. Change is coming to Columbus, and this is central towards what Columbus is going to look like in 5, 10, 15, 25, 30 years from now. And as I think Mr. Celebrezzi said, we're probably not going to be able to get everything into this that folks may want, but the goal here is to make sure that we have a code that is better reflective of what we want the community to look like moving forward, and a code that is more comprehensive. So again, we get away from these individual site-by-site decisions and much more of a guiding process for the city at large as we try and channel this growth. And I think if there's anything I've heard from folks in the community, that has been a through line in which folks want to see that growth channeled in a way that is appropriate for as appropriate as possible for their neighborhood moving forward. So I do want to again thank Mr. Wheeler and everyone from the panel tonight. Want to again thank the council staff, Andrew Dyer, Andy McDowell, Kevin McCain, and Mark Carter, and the CTV team. Thank you for being here tonight. Again, just want to repeat, our code needs changing. And council's committed to doing that and working with the department on that topic. But I think as our last speaker mentioned, we're not rushing this. We're trying to get this right, which is why this has been a months-long process to date, and it's going to be months-long moving out from here. That said, we also know there's immediacy with the amount of folks that are moving to this city and the housing needs and the job needs that exist. So we're trying to be very thoughtful about what is happening and how quickly it's happening, but we also know that change is happening just as quickly, if not quicker, because of the growth of Columbus. So again, want to thank you all for being here, and again, want to say it again, an extra special thanks to all of our area commissions and civic association leaders that, again, have been engaged on this topic for decades in Columbus. This is a generational conversation, and there's a reason why so many of you have been doing this for so long, and your perspective is going to be incredibly needed and valued as we move towards legislation in 2024. And with that, certainly want to wish everyone a great evening, and again, thank you for being here tonight.